Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-News Podcast. I'm your host, Katie Grasso, and thank you for tuning in. Today's date is September 6th, and as always, I've got 5 happy stories for you. First up, a lost monastery is found in the UK, an endangered bird is rediscovered, and a massive coral growth is found as well. After the music break, a hermit gets a huge helping hand after their cabin burns down, and Argentina passes a law to help transgender people work in the public sector. Apologies in advance if the sound quality is a little off. The headphone jack on my laptop suddenly stopped working, which makes it harder to accurately check how everything sounds. I plan to get it fixed, but I wanted to get this episode out first, so I hope it's not too much of an issue. With that said, let's get on to the stories. Throughout history, there have been many powerful leaders. Kings, queens, warriors, prophets. The list could go on, but unfortunately, many have been lost to history. And those we do know, we don't always know much about. The further back in time we try to look, the harder it is to find knowledge, because unlike physical objects like weapons or pottery, knowledge relies on humans passing it along from generation to generation. One such piece of knowledge was the location of the monastery that Queen Sinarith ruled from, but thanks to a dedicated team, that knowledge has been rediscovered. Queen Sinarith ruled Mercia with King Offa 4 decades before the Vikings arrived in Britain. From 796 until she died, Queen Sinarith ruled as the royal abbess from her monastery. The location of the monastery was lost until just recently, when a team from the University of Reading and local volunteers discovered the ruins of a building in Cookham, just outside the village of Berkshire. The ruins consisted not only of timber remains from the buildings the monks and nuns lived in, but jewelry, crockery, and personal items as well. Dr. Gabor Thomas, the archaeologist leading the excavation, commented, "Sinarith is a fascinating figure. A female leader who clearly had genuine status and influence in her lifetime. The items that have been uncovered will allow us to piece together a more detailed impression of how the monks and nuns who lived here ate, worked, and dressed. This will shed new light on how Anglo-Saxon monasteries were organized and what life was like in them." 2 discoveries in particular show just how powerful the queen was during her time. The first is coins minted with her image on them, and letters written between King Offa and King Charlemagne show that the French ruler addressed both Offa and Sinarith in his responses. The excavation team believed that they might even find the queen's body at the monastery, though there's no word on if they've done so yet. Even so, it's fun to imagine what her life must have been like during her time there. While we may never know for sure what the queen's life was like, we can take clues from history and from stories from that time. Knowledge of any kind from the past, whether real or not, can be fascinating. And as a product of the past, we should all take the time to learn what we can, so that others don't have to repeat it. It goes without saying, but the less there is of something, the harder it is to find. For example, if you've got 1,000 marbles and only 3 are red, you're gonna have a hard time finding those 3 red marbles. The same goes for animals. Unless we're keeping a real close eye on them, like with pandas and tigers, endangered species can disappear in the blink of an eye, which was almost, but not quite the case for the kiwi-kiu, a bird from Hawaii. The kiwi-kiu, also known as the Maui parrotbill, is It's a small, golden bird with a thick beak that it uses to remove bark from trees to get at the insects underneath. Only 150 remained in 2019 due to human activity, feral pigs, wildcats, and mosquito-transmitted diseases when conservationists took 7 kiwi-Q to Maui's Nakula Natural Area Reserve. Sadly, 5 of them were killed by avian malaria, and the last 2 were believed to have suffered the same fate, until a few weeks ago when one of the kiwi-Q was spotted and identified by the band around its leg. Zach Pizzillo, a researcher for Hawaii's Department of Land and Natural Resources, was the one who discovered the bird when he heard its distinct song. A couple of weeks later, he spotted the bird in a reserve that covers the Haleakala volcano. Pizzillo explained, it then sang about 10 times across a gulch in some koa trees. It dropped down into some kolea trees, where it spent the next 20 minutes calling and actively searching through the berries, bark, and leaves. I walked down into the gulch to get a closer look. Dr. Hannah Mooch of the Maui Forest Bird Recovery Project added, "This is an amazing sign of hope for the species, as we still may have time to save them. This is a hopeful sign that a population of kiwi-Q and other native forest birds could survive in restored landscapes in the future, especially without mosquitoes and disease." Even when the odds seemed to be against these birds, they still found a way to survive. It may have taken a long time to find them again, but just because something isn't always visible doesn't mean that it's not there, as this little bird has shown us. Life is incredibly resilient when given the chance to be so, but that doesn't mean that we should make things harder for it. Give nature a chance to breathe, and life will be easier for you as well. Coral is something that I've covered multiple times on the show, including the previous episode, but it's still something important. Coral reefs provide shelter and hunting grounds for fish, create oxygen through the algae that lives in them, and even provide food for smaller fish. They also act as a barrier to break up waves, so that larger ones can't form and cause damage. The larger the reef, the greater these benefits are, so you can only imagine how much coral the size of a double-deckered bus contributes. Researchers have discovered an absolutely massive coral structure that measures 5.3 meters tall by 10.4 meters wide. As I said in the opening, that's similar to the size of a double-deckered bus. Researchers from James Cook University confirmed the size of the coral, which beat the old record for widest coral by 8 feet, and ranked 6th for the tallest coral. The coral is part of the Horites genus, and was able to grow so large in part due to being in an area that's rarely explored. As for the name, the researchers talked with the indigenous Manbara people and settled on Muga Dambi, which means big coral. Points for straightforwardness, but none for creativity. Horites coral grow by secreting layers of calcium carbonate beneath their bodies as they grow to form the foundation of coral reefs. 30% of their structure is made from green boring sponge, as well as turf and green algae, while the remaining 70% is living matter. When able to, coral can grow for hundreds of years, as shown by the age of this particular reef, which is believed to be between 421 and 438 years old. The oldest documented reef in the Barrier Reef is 436 years old, which means that these two would have started forming around the same time. Just as the ecosystems on land are important, the ones in the sea are just as vital. By taking care of them, we take care of ourselves as well. Coral provides shelter for fish, and the more fish in the ocean, the more there are for us to eat and study. By nurturing nature, nature will nurture us in return, providing us with what we need, as long as we give it what it needs. While it may not be something we strictly need, everybody likes listening to music, so let's go to the music break. That was Lights by Roa. Now on to the last two stories. While many people can't imagine living without the comforts of modern technology, some can't imagine living with them. For that reason, some people choose to become hermits, isolating themselves from the rest of society for one reason or another, such as River Dave. The 81-year-old has been living off the grid for almost 3 decades, but when a fire burned down his home, those living on the grid helped him to rebuild. River Dave, also known as David Lidstone, had been living in a modest A-frame cabin on the banks of the Merrimack River in New Hampshire that he built himself. Although he says that the previous owner had given him permission, the current owner was taking steps to legally remove River Dave, citing zoning and environmental violations. On the same day that River Dave was in court dealing with a civil contempt charge for not leaving his home, his cabin burned to the ground. Thankfully, his cats and chickens weren't hurt, but it still left them without a home. Although estranged from his family, River Dave had made friends with the occasional kayaker or boater who passed by, one of those being Jody Gideon. Gideon had hoped that the legal issues would end peacefully, but after the fire, that was no longer a concern. He didn't want his friend to be out of a home, so Gideon and his friend Sharon Copello quickly set up a GoFundMe page to help River Dave get a new home. Word spread quickly, and not only donations, but offers for places to stay came rolling in as well. The goal of $15,000 was quickly met, but what happened next, no one would have expected. On August 11th, Alexander Karp, a New Hampshire resident and billionaire CEO of Palantir Technologies, wrote the old man a check for $180,000 for future expenses. Everyone involved, including River Dave, were moved to tears by the incredible generosity. River Dave told Concord Monitor, "How can I express myself and my gratitude towards something like that? I start to tear up whenever I think about it. For an old logger who always had to work, for anyone to give you that type of money, it's incredibly difficult for me to get my head around." He also told the Associated Press that the outpouring of kindness gave him a realization, and I quote, "I feel about as good as I ever have in my life. Maybe the things I've been trying to avoid are the things that I really need in life. I grew up never being hugged or kissed, or having any close contact. I had somebody ask me once about my wife, 'Did you really love her?' And the question kind of shocked me for a second. I'd never loved anybody in my life. And I shocked myself because I hadn't realized that. And that's why I was a hermit. Now I can see love being expressed that I never had before." The money that's being raised is being held in a trust for him. He'll be staying at an undisclosed location over the winter, and construction for his new home will start sometime next year at a yet unnamed building site. This is an incredible act of kindness, with no expectation of anything in return. People doing acts of kindness without expecting anything in return, just because they want to help others, is not always easy to do. It takes effort, in this case money, and time, which can be the hardest thing to give, as time is a limited resource. How you choose to spend that time, whether with other people or by yourself, your choice is valid and all your own. Protection, and more importantly acceptance, of the LGBT community has grown and improved over the years thanks to new laws, better education, and more public acceptance. Unfortunately, there are still a lot of places where people who aren't straight or identify as a different gender than what they were born as still face discrimination. It can be as simple as people being rude to you, to as horrible as being killed. Thankfully, that second one isn't as common as it used to be, but there's still a long way to go. And Argentina has helped take a step down that road with a new trans employment law. This past June, Argentina passed a law creating a 1% quota for transgender people employed in the public sector. Some examples of public sector jobs are economics, accountants, teachers, nurses, and social workers. Essentially, anything that isn't a private business. And this new law means that at least 1% of those jobs should be held by transgender people. Argentinian reporter Danielle Politi explained in an interview with NPR that what sets this diversity quota apart from others, and I quote, is that the requirements to get the jobs will be slightly different. For example, education requirements that are minimums to get certain public sector jobs may not be considered for this population. Also, things like criminal records can be excused, so there's a certain leeway to recognize that the trans population has lived hardships that maybe did not allow them to get the same kind of education and the same kind of experience in the workforce than other workers. He further explains that the reason the government went with 1%, and I quote, is largely symbolic. There is no real accounting for how many transgender people there are in Argentina, and the 1% figure was a way to symbolize that they're going to be a part of the government. They're part of society. The average life expectancy in Argentina is 77 years old, but for trans people, that expectancy is only 41, and as little as 10% have held what would be considered normal jobs. This new law is a huge step towards improving that, giving trans people new job opportunities that they might not have had otherwise. All of us are people, and we become better people when we learn to accept and embrace one another. We might not understand another person's life, but we should always try to do so, to make not only our own lives, but the lives of everyone around us better. Here's today's advice. Instead of throwing out old clothes that no longer fit, but are in good shape otherwise, donate them instead. Even if you're no longer using them, someone else could make good use out of them. The same with old furniture and electronics. Look up services that will collect larger items for you, and see if any friends or family can make use of what you're looking to get rid of. If no one takes it, there are plenty of others out there who will. That's it for today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to support this podcast, you can find it on YouTube, Spotify, Google and Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and Spreaker. Links can be found in the description, and until next time, remember that there is still some good in the world. You just gotta look for it. Take care out there, everyone.